Okay, well, while everybody's taking their seats, and I think a few more students will be filtering in, we'll just do a quick introduction and then let Dr. Wolfram begin his presentation. But just a quick hello. Good afternoon and welcome to the Baker Institute. The Baker Institute Student Forum is pleased to host Dr. Gary Wolfram today for his lecture, Is Capitalism Good for the Poor? This event was made possible through the support of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, ISI, and the Hillsdale Foundation. ISI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan educational organization. It works to enhance the quality and breadth of college education and to provide resources necessary to promote this goal. ISI is showcasing some of their books that you saw upon entering the auditorium, and they're having a free raffle. If you haven't already and you'd like to enter the raffle, please completely fill out the cards and turn them in. They will be raffling off their books at the conclusion of the lecture. And then, of course, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gary Wolfram, who, as I mentioned before, will answer today's question, Is Capitalism Good for the Poor? Dr. Wolfram is a professor of economics and public policy at Hillsdale College. He also runs his own consulting firm, which specializes in taxation and policy analysis. He is on the board of numerous organizations, including Michigan State Board of Education, Enterprise Zone Authority, Strategic Fund Board, and Housing Development at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. Dr. Wolfram has written extensively on economic policy, and we are very happy to be hosting him at the Baker Institute today.
Well, thank you all for coming. I'd like to also thank the Baker Institute and the Hillsdale Foundation, as well as ISI, for allowing me the opportunity to come down here. Sort of an interesting question: what is capitalism good for the poor? Because my sense is immediately yes, is going to be the answer. But if I talk to people and I'm talking to them about, gee, I'm going to give a talk on is capitalism good for the poor, they always, well, is it good for the poor, right? And so I think it's very interesting that we sort of need to be able to respond why it's good for the poor and be able to do that in a way that people can catch on. Because if we think that capitalism isn't good for the poor, if we think it's bad for the poor, then it makes it much harder for people to want to sustain this system, and they'll always be trying to alter it, and it actually will have unintended consequences. But first I want to talk a little bit about what is capitalism. And capitalism is not big government gets together with big business and does things that benefit them. Capitalism is a system of social organization that's based on private property rights. I need to know, do you own this thing? Or do I own this thing in order to exchange? Because the next major component of capitalism is a system that's based on voluntary exchange. And that's very important, that it's not a system that's based on you have to do something. Every action that occurs in a market system, both parties had to get better off, right? Because if it's a system of voluntary exchange, I don't know about here in Houston, but in Hillsdale, when I go into the Walmart there, they don't start throwing stuff into my cart and then make me buy it when I get out the door, right? Anything that I put in the cart, I want to buy. And I don't get to the end, to the checkout counter, and say to Mr. Walmart, hey, I'm going to give you $5 for the whole lot, and he has to give it to me. What has to happen is Mr. Walmart tells me, here's how much I'm willing to take for this DVD, and then I decide whether I want it or not. And in Hillsdale, we don't have vans that drive around and pick people up off the streets and then take them to the Walmart and chain them behind the checkout counter. Everybody that's there behind the checkout counter is there because they've agreed with Mr. Walmart that they're willing to stand there behind the checkout counter if they get paid what Mr. Walmart wants to pay them. So everybody at the Walmart is happy. I mean, that's why there's a smiley face as their symbol, right? Everybody walking out of that parking lot is happier than when they started. Otherwise, they wouldn't be there. So a system of voluntary exchange ensures that there's not exploitation, right? Now, it also is a system of limited government. You need government to have market capitalism work, as we have. How many of you here have ever heard of Leviathan, the book Leviathan, right? How many have ever read Leviathan? Well, that's pretty good, actually. There's a whole host of books which everyone's heard of and no one's read. And it turns out, unfortunately, I was asking my students yesterday about Beauty and the Beast, and they'd all heard of it. None of them had read Beauty and the Beast. So that's now on my list of books. But in any event, Hobbes says, in the absence of government, life will be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And why is that? That's because the strong will prey upon the weak, right? Somebody will take your stuff. So you need government to make this whole thing work, because I got to have property rights, right, in order for this whole thing to work. Now, but government is not to be able to do any old darn thing. Capitalism works where you get to decide what you're going to do, and I get to decide what I'm going to do, and that's how it works. And that means government has got to be limited to pretty much the protection of life, liberty, and property. That leads us to the last part of what capitalism is about. It's about rule of law, not the rule of man. Rule of law means I know what the rules are going to be from day to day. There's not arbitrary power. All of a sudden, the rules can change tomorrow. Let's say I'm building a nuclear power plant, right? And it's going to cost $5 billion to build the thing. I need to know before I start building this thing that there's what the rules are going to be and that they're not likely to change. Right? If you read Madison Federalist 62, Madison says this, that he says, well, little avail if the laws are made by men of our own choice, or the laws be so voluminous they cannot be read, or so incoherent they cannot be understood, or so unpredictable that no man who knows what the law is today can guess what it is tomorrow. Well, we need to know those things to make this building come into existence. Right? To make any of these factories or any of these houses or any of these restaurants come into existence, whoever's building this and investing it needs to know that the rules can't be changed arbitrarily. So what are some key characteristics of capitalism? What does it look like? Well, as I said before, it's a system of voluntary exchange, which means that all parties have to benefit. If you're not going to benefit, you don't have to do it. Now, how does it work then? How do I get wealthy in a market capitalist system? There's only one way. Make something for other people, right? Because you can't force them to buy your stuff. The only way you can get wealthy in a market system is to please others. In fact, the Bible says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. In a market system, that's not good enough. You got to figure out what they're going to want. They don't even know they're going to want yet, right? 10 years ago, I didn't know I was going to want an Xbox 360 for my son for Christmas, right? But somebody over there at Sony was thinking, oh, wow, Gary might want this Xbox 360 one day. I think I'll make one for him. And so that's how you get wealthy in a market system. How many people in here have ever used anything that's Microsoft involved? Something from Microsoft, all right? How many in here have ever paid to hear me give a speech before? You see, that's why Bill Gates is rich and I'm not. Okay? I mean, this isn't rocket science here. That is the only way that you get rich. And if you have a system where you can produce stuff for millions and millions of people internationally, guess what? You're going to get rich. So what does that mean? It means there's an incentive to innovate. There's an incentive to do things for other people, and an incentive to think things of which are new. In fact, in a market capitalist system, if you innovate and you make something that other people want, you're going to get wealthy. Now, there's a risk to doing that, right? Steve Jobs didn't know that we were all going to like the iPhone. He didn't know we were going to like the iPad. He didn't know that we were going to like the iPod. He was just guessing. And he had to invest, and he had to make prototypes, and he had to do all this stuff to try to make it work. But he did. Why? Because if he was successful, then he could get wealthy. And so who gets wealthy in a market system are those people that please others. And you don't get wealthy by what? By just selling to the rich, right? There's not enough of them. If you're going to be a multimillionaire, you didn't get rich by selling to the few rich people. What you did was you made it, for example, let's take the guys at YouTube. In January of 2005, these two guys were trying to send an email of a video of a party they went to their friends. They couldn't do it. And so what do they say? They say, you know what? I bet a lot of other people are having the same problem. I'm going to do something to fix that so all these other people can use it, right? So in January 2005, they start YouTube. In October of 2006, they sell it to Google for $1.6 billion. Now, how many in here have ever used YouTube? Okay? That's why Google paid $1.6 billion for it. That's why those guys are rich, right? So this system has to be the most efficient way of organizing our resources. And why is that? If it's a system of voluntary exchange, then I have to pay what economists call the opportunity cost of the resources. That is, if you own steel, and you could get $100 for that steel selling it to Ford Motor Company, I can't give you $90 for it and get it. Right? The only way I can get that steel away from you is if I pay you the value that you could have made from that steel in its next best alternative. Whether it's your labor, whether it's piano wire, no matter what it is. The only way I get it is to pay what its value to the next best alternative is. Then what do I have to do? I have to combine it and make it into something that you guys want to pay more for, that you value even more. You don't get if you use up resources worth $100 and turn it into something that people are going to pay $90 for, guess what? You go out of business, right? You become General Motors, okay? You become Pan American Airlines. You become out of business. Why? Because the market system doesn't allow you to make a less use of resources than they could be used in their next best alternative. What does that mean? There cannot be a more efficient way of allocating resources. Just the logic of that says there cannot be a more efficient way of doing that, right? I got to pay the value of the next best alternative, take those resources and make something of greater value, I go away, right? So profit then becomes the measure of how efficient you are. If ExxonMobil makes $15 billion in profit this quarter, what does that mean? What it means is they took resources worth X and they turned them into something that you guys wanted to pay 15 billion plus X for, right? Well, Congress ought to be having hearings about how amazing it is that these people did such a fantastic job making so much profit. Because the only way they made profit was to make lots and lots of people happy. Happier than they would have otherwise been. So now what's the alternative system? The alternative system is a central plan system. Well, central planners decide, here's what's going to get produced, how it's going to be produced, right? Who's going to get it? And why doesn't that system work? That system doesn't work for two reasons. And Ludwig von Mises wrote a book in 1920 called Socialism, where he laid this out. He was looking at the Bolshevik Revolution going on. He said, hey guys, guess what? Ain't going to work out for you. One day, it's all going to come crashing down. Why is that? Because it can't produce wealth for the masses. He wrote a book in 1927 called Liberalism. And he said, what's my main concern? Producing wealth for the masses. And there's only one social organization that can do that, and that's market capitalism. That socialism and fascism that was going on in the 1920s, progressivism in the United States, he says, hey, they all want to do the right thing. They all want to produce wealth for the masses. You know, Marx didn't all say, hey, we're all going to be equal and we're all going to be living like refugees, right? The impression is that you can produce wealth for the masses, but you can't, because it can't solve two problems. One's the incentive problem. How do I get people to work hard, right? How do I get people to innovate? Now, you will get people to innovate just because they're nice, right? What did Adam Smith said? He said, I don't rely upon the benevolence of the butcher, the baker, the brewer for my dinner, but rather on their self-interest. But he didn't say, I'll never get a benevolent butcher, right? Some people will just innovate and do nice things just because they feel better doing it. But as a system, it doesn't work, right? In a market system, when you earn profit, it drives you to innovate. If you look at oil, and what was the problem with John D. Rockefeller when he bought up all this oil in Ohio? Too much sulfur. So what did he do? He hired up a bunch of scientists to figure out how to deal with the sulfur in the oil so he could refine it. There's incentives to innovate because he's going to gain profit from doing that. But let's suppose we solve that problem. The big problem is the information problem. How can I possibly know what 310 million Americans are going to want for lunch tomorrow, or for dinner tomorrow, or how much toilet paper they're going to want? Not only that, but I have to get it so that I got exactly the right amount of stuff everywhere at every place in the United States, every retail establishment in America. We just don't even think about how amazing this is. I mean, this is totally amazing, right? When I heard I was going, okay, I'm flying to Houston. Today I'm flying off to Fort Lauderdale. I'm going to give a talk out there tomorrow. Okay? I'm flying back to Hillsdale the next day. So I didn't think, oh my gosh, I better pack my suitcase with toilet paper and every other darn thing because it might not be there when I get to Houston, right? I know when I get to Houston, whatever I want, if I forgot it, guess what? It'll be there. And today, 9 million people are going to wake up in the New York City area, and there'll be just the right amount of Starbucks, and there'll be the right amount of Post cereal, and there'll be the right amount of oranges, and the right amount of apples, and the right amount of dental floss, and every other darn thing. Tires and auto repair, exactly the right amount of it. How can that possibly be? If a central planner had to figure out exactly how much of this stuff to have at every retail outlet in America, couldn't possibly do it. But how does it work? Prices, right? The market system works through the price system. If there's too much hamburger, what's going to happen? What's going to happen if there's too much hamburger? Yeah, price is going to go down. If there's too little hamburger, price will go up. And if there's too much hamburger and the price starts going down, we start making less hamburger, and people start buying more hamburger. And if we have the price of hamburger going up, producers will make more hamburger and we'll buy less of it, and it'll come into equilibrium. The market solves those two problems that a central planner can't possibly do. In fact, let me just quickly read you a thing from, this is from Venezuela. Venezuela decided to, hey, we're going to start central planning, right? We're going to do socialism. How's that working out? It says it's 10 a.m. and tempers are already flaring at the CAD supermarket in Caracas. The store has just taken delivery of 2 pallets of 4 and 11-pound sacks of sugar, with dozens of shoppers swarming around him. Roberto Fernandez tries to pass out the bags one by one. The clerk hands a smaller one to a gray-haired woman, but she flings it back. "How dare you tell me I can't have the one of the larger bags," she screams. The sack splits open, spilling sugar everywhere. Within 10 minutes, the shipment has vanished. "I'm so fed up with these food shortages," Fernandez mutters as he sweeps up the mess. "People get desperate and start behaving like animals." All right? It's not a matter that Venezuela doesn't have enough income, right? Doesn't have enough sale of their oil to make it so that they can have enough food. The problem is they don't know how to get the food to the right spot at the right time because they're not relying on a market capitalist system anymore. They're relying on on central planning. So why did the poor benefit in particular? Well, first of all, there's a huge incentive to make things for the poor. As I said before, I'm going to get rich. In fact, the guy that started Intel said, when am I going to get wealthy? When everybody can afford a laptop computer. That's when I'm going to get wealthy. There's an incentive to make stuff for the poor. In fact, that's what the Industrial Revolution was about. If you'd ever take a history class, the Industrial Revolution was really about shifting the supply curves out to the right by changing the way that we organize ourselves. In fact, let me just read you a little thing. This is from the Wall Street Journal on India. It says, India's many engineers whose best known role is to help Western companies expand or cut costs are now turning their attention to the purchasing potential of the nation's own 1 billion population. Trends surfaced when Tata Motors' tiny $2,000 car hit the Indian roads in July. It says, for the farmer who wants to save for the future, one Indian entrepreneur has developed what is in effect a $200 portable bank branch. For the village housewives, a wood-burning stove has been presented to make more heat and less smoke for $23. For the slum family struggling to get clean water, there is a $43 water purification system. For the villager who wants to give his child a cold glass of milk, there is a tiny $70 refrigerator that can run on batteries. And so on. What's going on in India is they move into a market capitalist system. And when they do, guess what? I got 1 billion people out there I can sell stuff to. And if I can make $1 on 1 billion people, I can get rich. A lot richer than I am right now, right? So there's an incentive to just make stuff for the poor. But the second thing is there's an incentive to make them more productive. There's an incentive. So why are you poor? You're poor because you're not making enough stuff that other people want. Okay? That's why you're poor. So how can I make it so that you can make more stuff? by giving you what economists call capital, giving you machinery, giving you buildings, giving you computers, giving you human capital, giving you education. So what is my incentive if I'm a producer and I want to make some profit? I want to go and make use of these people who are low wages. So what do? I move capital. Outsourcing is not about shipping jobs. There is not one job being shipped out of America, ever. Go down to Houston, look in the harbor and see how many ships you got there with crates on them saying jobs being shipped somewhere. What happens is capital moves to where the low-wage labor is. And once countries like India and China open up and allow capital to flow there, what happens is they get real productive. Now, most of you in this audience are too young to remember what made in Japan meant. But when I was a kid, made in Japan meant cheap, shoddy stuff that was made by low-skilled labor. And now what's made in Japan mean? Lexus, right? Labor costs in Japan are higher than they are in the United States. Why? What happened? Capital moved to where the low-wage labor was. And that's what's going to happen in China, and that's what's going to happen in India. And as it does, they're going to get real productive. There's going to be more stuff for us. And they're going to be buying stuff that we make. And who's going to benefit from that? The poor are going to benefit from that. Does it work? Of course it works. If you look at India. India was a place that decided it was going to go off and be socialist, right? It wasn't going to rely on the market capitalist system that the colonizers did. So what happened there? If you're poor, how poor is it to be poor in Mumbai, India? If you're poor in Mumbai, India, the average person in Mumbai, India lives in a dwelling in the slums that has 48 square feet, 6 by 8. All right? Families live in that. In most of the parts of Mumbai, India that are in the slum, half the family members have to sleep on their side in order for them all to fit in the place. Right? That's what's the legacy of socialism in India. 1.4 billion people today live on less than $1.25 per day. 27% of all children in developing countries are underweight or stunted, primarily in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, 27% of all children in developing countries are stunted or underweight. 3% of children that are poor are stunted or underweight in the United States. In 1980, 1 out of every 10 poor people lived in Sub-Saharan Africa. In 2000, 1 of every 3 poor people live in Sub-Saharan Africa. Why is that? Because the economies of China and India are moving forward as they've moved to market capitalism. Life expectancy in Sub-Saharan Africa has fallen from 50 to less than 45 since 1990. If I was living in Sub-Saharan Africa, I'd be dead now, right? I mean, it's a big difference on how you organize your resources. The number of poor in Sub-Saharan Africa has increased from 41 to 46% of the population, up from 164 million to 314 million. Now, what is it like to be poor in capitalism, right? Robert Rector of the Heritage Foundation has done several studies of the poor, looking at people who are poor according to the Census Bureau definition. And let me just give you some of the data. 40% of all poor households in the United States own their own home. On average, a 3-bedroom home with 1.5 baths, a garage, a porch, or a patio. 80% of all poor people in the United States have air conditioning. Now, I grew up in Fresno, California, a lot like Texas. Nobody had air conditioning when I was a kid, right? We would cut a hole in the roof that had a pan of water, and then it had a fan on the top, and a blow hot, humid air. It was called a swamp cooler. Some of you don't remember swamp coolers, but basically just blew hot, humid air and you pretended it was cooling you off. Nobody could afford air conditioning. Today, 80% of all poor people in the United States have air conditioning. 2/3 of all poor people have more than 2 rooms per person. Now compare that with Mumbai, India, where you all got to sleep on your side to fit in. The average poor person in the United States has 2/3 of them have more than 2 rooms per person. The average poor person has more living space than the average individual in Paris, London, Vienna, or Athens. 78% of a VCR or DVD player, 97% of a color television, 89% of a microwave oven. You get the idea, right? Being poor in the United States is much different than being poor in somewhere else. What happened in China and East Asia, right? There's a grand experiment. They're going from a centrally planned system in China and India, central planning, and moved to market capitalism. In 1978, China started special economic enterprise zones. In 21 years from when it started, 400 million people moved out of poverty in China. 30% more than the population of the United States moved out of China in a 20-year period when they began to use market capitalism. Gross domestic product per capita increased 5 times. Those people living on less than 70 cents per day fell from 64% of the population to 17% of the population. In 1980, East Asia was the poorest region in the world. It's now leading in economic growth. China's growth rate in 2007, 13% growth rate of GDP. Growth rate 9% in 2008, 8.7% in 2009, 9.9% in 2010, right? And those are numbers that are when we had an international recession going on. India got started a little later. India moved into the market process in the early 1990s, mostly on the service sector, and they're still pretty regulated on the manufacturing end. But India's growth rate, 9% in GDP in 2007, 7.4% in 2008, 6.5% in 2009, 8.2% in 2010. Now, if you think of the rule of 72, if you're growing at 8%, you're going to double your standard of living in 9 years, right? People 18 years from now are 4 times wealthier than you are. That's what growth does in those areas. If we look at historically, during 1,000 years of monarchy, mankind's average income rose about 50%. Since 1820, since really a market capitalism really has been established as the social order in the Western world, average income has risen by more than 1,000%. In the last 100 years, we've created more wealth, increased life expectancy more, and reduced poverty more than the prior 100,000 years. I mean, if you just look at the expenditures of the bottom 1/5 of the U.S. household today is greater than the expenditures of the median household in 1972. So the poor are growing wealthy, and where are they growing wealthy? They're growing wealthy in the West. Let me just say this. I'm God, and you're going to be born, and you get to pick whatever country you're going to be born in. But the rule is you're going to be the poorest person there. You're going to be the poorest person in that country. But you can pick the country. Now let me read you from the 2011, the latest Index of Economic Freedom that the Heritage Foundation puts out. Take the top 10, Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, Switzerland, Canada, Ireland, Denmark, the United States, Bahrain, and Chile, rounding out that bottom part. So you could be poor there, or you could be poor, you could be the poorest person in what? In North Korea, Zimbabwe, Cuba, Eritrea, Venezuela, Myanmar, Libya, Democratic Republic of Congo, Iran, Republic of Congo, Turkmenistan. Now, where would you be rather the poorest person? In Canada or Democratic Republic of Congo? Right? We know what the answer is. This is not hypothetical. This isn't like, there's maybe it could be this way. We know that the answer is you don't want to be poor in a place that has not been involved in market capitalism. And it makes a difference if you think of the earthquake in Chile and the earthquake in Haiti, right? Or even the earthquake in Japan. The earthquake in Chile was about 50 times less than the earthquake the earthquake in Haiti is 50 times less power than the earthquake in Chile. Yet 250,000 people are killed in Haiti in that earthquake. And in Chile, you had 497 people were killed, and half of those were killed in the tsunami. Same thing in Japan. Most of the deaths that happened in Japan were not because the buildings fell down when an earthquake happened. They were there because there was this major tsunami happen. It was a 9 scale on the earthquake scale. In fact, the Haiti earthquake was only a 7.0 earthquake. much smaller than the one in Japan. And yet you have hundreds of thousands of people die in Haiti. And why is that? Because Haiti ranked 147th in Index of Economic Freedom, and Chile ranked 11th, right? The buildings are more stable, everything's sturdier in places. It makes a big difference how you organize your resources. Let's just sum up, and then I'll take some questions here. But if we look at the income per capita and we look at the Economic Freedom Index, now this is a different index. The Fraser Institute also puts out an index of economic freedom. They're very similar to the Heritage Foundation, but the Fraser Institute and Heritage will oftentimes have different sets of data that they incorporate into their analysis. But if you take the bottom quartile, that is, you take the least free countries in the Index of Economic Freedom, their per capita income is $3,800. If you take the most free, their per capita income is $32,443. Nearly 10 times wealthier if you are in the most free countries than if you're in the least free countries. Now, let's take a look about the economic freedom and the income share of the poorest 10%. So yeah, these countries are a lot wealthier. What's the poorest share of it? The share of the poor of the income in the least free countries is 2.4%. This is the 10%. If you take the bottom 10%, they've got 2.4% of the income. If you take the top 25%, the poor get 2.6%. They actually get a bigger share of a much bigger pie, a pie that's 10 times larger, and they get a bigger share of it. What about the income level of the poorest 10%? Let's take the income level of the people that are in the bottom 10% of the income distribution. If you look at those that are in the bottom part of the Index of Economic Freedom, $896 a year. That's the per capita income of the bottom 10%. In the most free countries, $9,105. Even great, 12 times larger. To be poorer, to be in the bottom 10%, you're 12 times wealthier if you're living in a country than the top Index of Economic Freedom than if you're at the bottom. What about growth rates? How fast are they growing? If you take those that are in the top 20%, they're growing at 2.4% annual rate. You look at the countries in the bottom 20%, they're growing at a 0.9%. So not only are they poorer, not only do they get a smaller share, but they're growing much slower than those that are in the top 20%. What about life expectancy? If you look at the average life expectancy in those countries that are in the bottom 25% of economic freedom, it's 59.4. If you look at the average life expectancy of those that are in the top 25, 79.12. On average, you're going to live 20 years longer just by being in a country that's in the top 25% of Index of Economic Freedom. It really makes a difference. The logic of it says the poor have to be better in a market capitalist system. The cross-section evidence says the poor are much wealthier in a market capitalist system. And the historical evidence says the poor are better once we turn to a market capitalist system. I oftentimes ask my students, what would you rather be? Who you are right now or King of England in 1260? You know? And in Michigan, you'd like to have indoor plumbing come February. And almost all of them say, yeah, I'd rather be me. So with that, I'll take some time for some questions. And if you don't ask any, I'll just start picking people at random. Yes.
So just a brief question. So you mentioned this kind of the stark contrast between the market capitalism system and more of kind of a socialist model. What about social democracies in Scandinavia, where the poor have paternity leave, maternity leave, guaranteed access to free education, all sorts of great social services? Aren't they better off in that system than a pure capitalist system? Yeah,
the question is, what about countries that are the Scandinavian countries that have a lot of social programs? And aren't the poor better off there? Well, first of all, they're still not centrally planned, right? There's a lot. We're really talking about a redistribution, right? They have a lot of redistribution, and so there's a difference between that. But even so, those Scandinavian countries are finding they got real problems right now. The economic growth rates are slowing down. And part of that comes about because, I don't know if you saw the movie Cinderella Man. In Cinderella Man, what happens is that the guy, I forget his name, Braddock, he's poor and it's during the Depression and he has to get in line and he gets some money from the welfare system. Then he gets a fight and he gets this big paycheck and he comes back and he pays the money back, right? We would no more think of doing that since 1965 and The Man in the Moon, because in 1965 we said, no, these welfare systems are not something that you should only use if you only need it. They're an entitlement system. And so you deserve it. You should get it. And what happens then is once it begins to be seen as an entitlement system, it doesn't work nearly as well. Charity works pretty well because under charity, you're not sure you're going to get it. And you don't alter your behavior. In fact, if you look at, actually, I have a little column in a thing called the Michigan View. It's an online thing, and it comes out on Fridays, Saturdays, Sunday. And I did one on over Christmas on Scrooge. And the thing about Scrooge is, remember when he comes in and the people come in and ask Scrooge, will you give us some money? And what he says is, are there no poorhouses, right? Don't they just take care of, doesn't the government take care of it? And in fact, Herbert Spencer said of the poor laws, which is the social welfare system in England, is that the problem with the social welfare system is not that the rich, it's not that the poor will take advantage of it, but rather the rich will think they don't have to take care of the poor, right? That's the problem. The rich do have to take care of the poor in a market system. I mean, market systems don't work very well if people don't do that. Yes?
Why is India protecting some sectors and opening up others for capitalism?
Yeah, that's a good question. Why is India protecting some sectors and opening up others for market capitalism? And part of that is, and I know some of you guys are going to have to leave because there's a class coming, but so feel free. But because we know, in a sense, that market capitalism works to create wealth for the poor. How do you get there from a centrally planned system that you got? It's how to make that transition is not well known. Russia has had some difficulties in trying to make that transition. Other places have done better. China is in that process right now. How quickly can they move? And I think India is trying to find a way to move towards market capitalism in a way that's not disruptive to the political structure. And so I think that's really why. I mean, they're trying to figure out the politics of because you've got a democratic society there. You can't just like upend, force the rules to change. So I think that's probably why. I think but you see India moving quickly. And then the question also is what happens with political freedoms. Mises points out that you can have political freedom. He says you can't have political freedom without economic freedom. If the government owns all the resources, if the government owns the media and the government owns the places where you can assemble and the like, you really can't have political freedom. But it's possible to have economic freedom without political freedom. Singapore is an example. But they tend to go all together. Once people have economic freedom, they tend to want to have political freedom. And that's going to be an interesting transition, I think, in China in particular, how they can handle that, because there's going to be more and more push for political freedom as they gain more economic freedom. Yes?
What's the best way to destroy market capitalism?
Well, the best way to destroy market capitalism is to try to impose central planning on it. To try to say, we're not happy with how this is turning out, and therefore we're going to impose our will on this. Market capitalism requires that you guys act according to your own plan. That's how it works, right? You decide what you're going to buy, what you're going to produce, etc. You can't have somebody else telling you. Because that's how the price system and the profit system all make it so that we all have the right amount of Starbucks coffee everywhere in America. Okay? And if what we do is we say, gee, I mean, it was interesting. People who want to have central planning have a vision about what the world's going to look like. If you read Bastiat's The Law, which he wrote in 1850, he says that's what socialists have a view of what they want the world to look like. And if you guys act according to your own plan, it's not going to turn out that way. So they will want to have it happen. So if what we do is we say, gee, we don't like that you guys aren't driving enough electric cars, and we're going to make it so that you all drive electric cars. Well, what'll happen? Resources get distorted. We'll have resources being used to not less value. And who's going to lose? The rich people are going to get by. Rich people are going to get by. Who's going to lose in this whole deal are the people that are poor. How do we maintain this system? Hayek says we only maintain this system if we know how it works and we believe in it. If you don't know how it works, if you think the reason Bill Gates got rich is not because we got hundreds of millions of people worldwide that use Microsoft product, if you think Bill Gates gets rich because he exploits the poor and exploits his workers and it forces you guys all to have that on your computer, then you're going to start asking your government to do things that are going to result in what? Slow economic growth. And Mises is very concerned about once the government starts to intervene, it causes unintended consequences, which causes further government intervention, which causes further unintended consequences, which lead to further government intervention. The healthcare situation is a prime example of that. You had all sorts of unintended consequences of the tax code, which resulted in your healthcare being a benefit that's tied with your job. I mean, my students, when they go get a job, they don't think, gee, maybe they're going to give me car insurance, or maybe they're going to give me homeowners insurance, or maybe they're going to give me fire insurance. But they all think they're going to give me health insurance. Why health insurance? Well, it's because of the tax code. Well, that creates a huge problem if you lose your job, right? Especially if you have a pre-existing condition, right? If you get cancer and you lose your job, hey, it's pretty hard to go out and start buying insurance through the market process. And so then what do we do? What's the answer? Well, more government intervention. Well, require insurance companies to give you insurance even if you have a pre-existing condition, right? And then that creates all sorts of other funny things going on. So understanding and just thinking about if you just wake up in the morning, you're just amazed that there's always the right amount of stuff everywhere. If you're just amazed at that, then I think you're a long ways towards restoring the market system. Yes?
The political leaders in the poor parts of the world have a major incentive to change the rules in their country so their people can become rich too. Mm-hmm. Why don't they take that step?
Well, why don't they take that step? Because it's not sure that they will still be the political leaders if they make that step. The political leaders in place, that's interesting because if you take a place like Nigeria, the political leaders, because they control the oil, can keep themselves powerful even though their people are poor. And you might remember the Iron Curtain, right? I mean, the Iron Curtain was there so that people couldn't peek out and see what was going on in the rest of the world. If you're the average person in Nigeria, you might not have a clue that the average poor person in America's got air conditioning, right? So now China's a different problem because how are the Chinese staying in power? They're staying in power because where are they getting the money to run the system? By taxing the middle class. So they got an incentive now to make this middle class big because they don't have oil that they can start generating revenue from. So you see China developing that way. Nigeria, Libya, those sorts of places where they've got the oil. If you're a ruler there, it might make your people better off, and you might be the benevolent dictator and say, hey, we're just going to do it. But the incentive might also be just, hey, I'm just going to keep the oil for myself and have my palace and keep the people at bay. Yes?
In the light of the recent economic meltdown, didn't the Securities Exchange Commission, wasn't the Securities Exchange Commission held responsible for lack of oversight of the finance sector's collapse? And isn't that an example of some amount of regulation required in this? Well,
the question is, was the Securities and Exchange Commission lax in enforcing things, and was that part of the problem in the recent recession? And does that require government regulation? Well, yeah. If you're committing fraud, that's a problem. All right. as I said, you need limited government. A market capitalist system doesn't run, although you can read Murray Rothbard and some other folks that'll tell you otherwise, but generally a market capitalist system doesn't run unless you've got a government entity protecting property rights, making sure contracts are fulfilled, making sure there's not fraud, those sorts of things. My own personal opinion was that the financial meltdown came about from the government setting the price of loanable funds. That is a centrally planned idea of deciding what the price of loanable funds was, on top of deciding that we don't like the way people buy houses. We'd rather have a really good renter become a really bad homeowner, and having all sorts of things which move the excess funds into the housing industry. I think that was a big cause of that. It created I don't know if you're interested in this, but there's a Austrian business cycle theory. This Austrian school with Ludwig von Mises and Hayek and those guys talk about malinvestment, that what happens is the monetary authorities, by altering the price of loanable funds, that is altering the interest rate, cause investment to occur in places where it's not sustainable. And then what happens when they eventually have to figure out they're either going to get hyperinflation or they got to start letting the interest rates go up, then it becomes clear this stuff's unsustainable. And then what happens? People have to get unemployed in order to move to where they are, which is this housing bubble was a classic Austrian business cycle story. If you fit to a lot of malinvestment in housing, people have to get laid off. And of course the government, by attempting to keep the housing market up, slows the transition. I mean, Hayek when he in 1975 he wrote a paper where he said, people ask me, now that you've got this unemployment problem, how am I supposed to deal with it? You should have asked me before. Once you've caused the distortion, the only way to get things back is to have people get unemployed so they can move from this sector to that sector. Yes?
I know it's wishful thinking, perhaps Pollyannish, to wish that whether through a benevolent dictator or representative democratic process, for an oil-rich nation, give every adult citizen a share of stock in that barrel of oil that they sell every day, and that'll create wealth, and they hold on to that share. They can't sell it for X number of years. You create a market for it. That would lift up a country.
Yeah, the point is that if you had a place like Libya or Iraq, or what if you gave everybody a share in the oil? Then that would create an incentive to protect property rights. It would an incentive to make good use of the property. In fact, you know what? I own stock in ExxonMobil. I own stock in Conoco. I don't care where the oil is, right? But if I'm in Iraq, I care where the oil is, because whoever gets control of the oil, right, gets control of the wealth. Because we have shares in the company rather than the government owning the oil, we don't care where it is. We're not going to go fight. Michiganders are going to run down to Texas and fight them over the oil fields, right? We'll just buy stock. And so if you did that in Iraq, and Milton Friedman suggested that, a number of people suggested that that's one way to get ourselves out of these problems, because you get tribal conflict over what? Over natural resources. Because if you get control of the government, you get control of the resources. There's not another way to get control of it unless you get control of the government. And so if the Middle East really turned itself into a market capitalist system, there would be a lot less conflict. We're not going to, we don't fight with Canada. We're not going to declare war on Canada tomorrow or war on Mexico tomorrow, right? They're not going to declare war on us because we have an integrated economic structure through market capitalism. So it not only creates wealth, but it reduces conflict. In fact, I think I don't know if this is a factoid or whether this is true, but no two countries have gone to war once they've got a McDonald's franchise. I've heard that as a story.
That was true up until Clinton started a war against Serbia.
Oh, and the Serbs had a McDonald's.
Yeah, there was a McDonald's in Serbia.
All right. But generally, you get the point, right? Once economies are integrated, it's much better to trade with them. And Adam Smith said this in Inquiry into the Nature of Cause of the Wealth of Nations. right? I mean, when there was a discussion when he was discussing whether to let the colonies go or not, he just said let them go. We're much better off just letting them go and trading with them. It's too expensive to try to maintain colonies over there.
Who said that?
Smith. That was Smith, you said.
Yes, Adam Smith, yeah, Wealth of Nations. All right, well, yes, one last question then, yes.
About the meltdown in the housing market, I work in finance and follow some of this stuff. Nearly half of the mortgages that were being bought in the secondary market were bought by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And those are government creations. Those were not free market creations. So we had government intervention in that market propping up demand for this ridiculously bad paper, which eventually...
Yeah, the Fannie Mae, the point is that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were heavily involved in not only in buying the mortgages, but also then in buying the mortgage-backed securities. In fact, Housing and Urban Development, the Secretary had required Fannie Mae to be purchasing, to have 62% of their mortgages by the end. 62% of their mortgages had to be subprime, and so we people respond to market incentives, right? I mean, if you sort of think about this, if I keep interest rates at 1% or 0% like I am now, what's going to happen? You're going to go to where you can gain return. So that means you're going to have to go into places where you can leverage, right? I mean, and where was a good place to leverage? Housing is an easy place to leverage, right? I can buy a $300,000 house for $30,000, and if it goes up to $310,000, I've made $10,000 on my $30,000. Unfortunately, leverage works the other way too. But it drove people to have incentives to leverage, and and that's happening now. Only I think what's going on is they're driving the stock market right now. I mean, because people are shy of the housing markets. But where can you go? I mean, you can put your money into your treasuries and get 0.25%. So I think one of the run-ups in the stock market's happening because we've got artificially low interest rates, and at some point they'll have to deal with that. Yes.
I'm sorry, I got here late, so you may have discussed this, but if you haven't. How does the current U.S. debt affect a poor person, say, in India?
How does the current U.S. debt affect a poor person in India? That's a very good question. Because the interesting thing about economics is it's so interrelated. It's a lot like ecology. If what I do is if I let sea lamprey into the Great Lakes, it's not just we get more sea lamprey. They start eating things, and other things eat them, and the whole ecology changes. So there is going to be some interconnection. I think as we run debt, how is this going to get paid off? In the end, this is going to get paid off by inflating. I mean, realistically, we're just going to inflate, and the question is how fast do we inflate? If you are what that will do is that will make the dollar less valuable. It will make, depending on everything else being held constant, depending on what India does, it will make the dollar less valuable, which means that it should make it so that our goods become cheaper for people in India. And so if the Indians are buying our stuff, it will make it cheaper. Now, what will it do? It'll make Indian goods and services. I mean, India primarily is on the service sector side that they are exporting services. It'll make their service sector more expensive for us. But probably there's a whole lot of other things going on. I have to think. I mean, professors' instinct is always to think you know the answer, right? Even if you don't, right? You're gonna say, yeah, I should be able to figure that out. Other than that, I don't really know. But it's gonna, I don't think it's gonna cause us to not be a reserve currency, because it's like the guys that are camping. And the guys that are camping, there's two guys camping in a pup tent, and a grizzly bear is clawing at the door, right? The flap of the tent. And the one guy starts putting his running shoes on. And the other guy says, hey, you can't outrun a grizzly bear. Another guy says, I don't have to outrun a grizzly bear. I just got to outrun you. And so we just have to be better than whatever else might be the reserve currency. We got to be better than the euro, or, I mean, the Swiss franc, there's probably not enough of it out there to really act as a world currency. It's possible that there might be some sort of commodity-based world currency that develops. And I mean, you wouldn't have thought that the pound sterling wouldn't become the world, would fall off as the world currency. So it's not impossible, but it's a big hurdle to displace an existing world currency. Now, we could do bad enough stuff that it happens, but it's not going to happen in the near future. All right, well, it's almost 1 o'clock, so I'll take any more questions? Well, last question, yes.
What is the ultimate result of raising or not raising the debt ceiling? I mean, what's the final?
Well, it's sort of interesting because I was Congressman Nick Smith's chief of staff in 1995 and 1996, the last time this happened. And it was sort of interesting. If you don't raise the debt limit, it's not like we're going to default on everything. If you don't raise the debt limit, what will happen is they won't be able to borrow in order to refinance the existing debt. Now, you might borrow in order to not make payments to other things, like to the Department of Health and Human Services or something, right? So it won't cause an immediate meltdown if the debt ceiling is not increased. There will be all sorts of talk about, oh my gosh, it's the end of the world going to happen. Why? Because they want to make sure that the Republicans don't use it as leverage to try to reduce the growth in entitlements. And so that's really what's going to happen. The media is going to go crazy and say, oh my gosh, the world's going to end. But even the same thing about the government shutdown. We shut the government down then. And I was talking to a reporter the other day, and I said, well, you remember when we shut the government down in 95, 96? Remember what happened there? He says, well, I was only 5. I don't remember, right? I said, well, do you remember your mom and dad telling you about how those bad, awful days when the government shut down? Do you remember that at all? Well, no, not really, right? So, people will be inconvenienced one way or the other, right? Bond traders may make a little money or lose a little money on the deal, but the reality is they're going to raise the debt limit. What are they going to get for it? And even if they don't raise it for a short period of time, it's not really going to make that much difference. Because the debt limits, the amount of debt that we're selling in order to refinance the existing debt is still not a big enough portion that it will cause a major problem. Now, to the extent that we're short-term debt and we got to roll it more, it's going to be a bigger problem. 95, 96, we didn't have such a short time frame on the debt. So it might be a bigger problem than it was when we were talking about it then. But, they're going to increase the debt limit, and it'll just be how much leverage they use. All right, with that, thank you very much. Thank you for having me.